The first sighting. The night air of Chicago in the 1930s carried a particular weight, thick with the scent of gasoline from passing cars, the faint smoke of distant factories, and the echo of jazz bleeding out from roadside taverns. The city was alive, but not all of its life was tethered to the world of the living. It was along Archer Avenue, a stretch of road, winding past cemeteries and dimly lit clubs, that whispers first began. Drivers spoke in hushed tones of a pale young woman in white, drifting like mist on the shoulder of the road. She appeared when the fog rolled heavy and the moon hung low, her figure sharp one moment, translucent the next. They said she was no ordinary hitchhiker. One winter evening in 1934, a man named Jerry Palis, a local Chicagoan known by his friends as Level-Headed, encountered her. The streets were slick with ice headlights, carving fragile tunnels through the dark. That was when he saw her, a girl standing alone near Resurrection Cemetery. She raised her hand timidly, as though asking for a ride. Jerry slowed, his Ford heart hammering. She was beautiful, but not in any worldly sense. Her dress clung like frost-pale satin glowing faintly in the glare of his headlights. Her hair, soft and curled, framed a face drained of color. Her eyes, gray, unblinking, watched him with the kind of stillness that suggested eternity. He asked if she needed a lift. She nodded. Her voice, when it came, was faint, almost swallowed by the rumble of the engine. Archer Avenue, please. Jerry drove in silence, nerves tightening as he stole glances at her. Something was wrong. Her skin seemed too cold, her breath too absent in the chilled air of the car. The radio hummed with static sputtering, as if unwilling to play, while she sat beside him. When they neared the gates of Resurrection Cemetery, she spoke again. "Stop here." Jerry turned his head to answer, only to find the seat beside him empty. The door had never opened. The girl was gone. Stories like Jerry's spread quickly. At taverns along Archer Avenue, men leaned over beer glasses, lowering their voices when her name came up. Women warned each other to walk alone after dark. And soon, the legend had a name whispered with dread: Resurrection Mary. The sightings multiplied. Taxi drivers, their shift clocks ticking past midnight, reported picking up a girl near ballroom halls and roadside bars. She asked for a ride, sat quietly, and then vanished when the cemetery gates loomed ahead. In one account, a cabbie claimed the girl left behind a damp impression on the leather seat, as if morning dew had seeped into the car. Another man swore she stepped into his car after a dance, her dress faintly shimmering under the neon sign of O. Henry Ballroom. They spoke little, yet he noticed her hands folded in her lap, fingers unmoving, stiff like porcelain. She asked to be dropped at the cemetery. By the time he looked again, the car was empty, the door locked from within. But it wasn't just the vanishing acts. Strange disturbances followed her trail. Club owners recalled nights when a beautiful blonde in white danced with strangers on the hardwood floor, always graceful, always silent. Yet when the music ended and the lights flickered back to full glow, no one could remember who she had left with. Some insisted they had touched her hand cold as stone before she drifted away into the night. The doorman of O. Henry Ballroom whispered of a pale figure pressing against the glass face, expressionless, before disappearing into the mist. Once tire tracks were found near the cemetery gates, where a driver claimed he swerved to avoid hitting a girl in white. No body was found. Newspapers took notice. Headlines ran in local columns: "Phantom Hitchhiker Haunts Archer Avenue. Mystery Girl Vanishes by Cemetery Gates." To skeptics, it was nothing more than folklore born of strong drinks and stronger imaginations. But to those who had seen her, the weight of their fear was undeniable. They described the same chilling details: the white dress, the golden hair, the gray eyes that did not blink. And always, always, the final destination, Resurrection Cemetery. Locals began to speculate. Some said Mary had been a young woman killed in a car accident, while leaving a dance her spirit doomed to wander the road she once traveled. Others believed she was buried within Resurrection Cemetery itself, restless in death. Gravediggers spoke of cold spots, sudden drops in temperature, as if an invisible figure walked past them. Visitors to the cemetery reported gates rattling, though no wind blew, and sometimes on the iron bars of the main gate handprints burned into the metal as if pressed by unseen hands desperate to leave. The legend deepened. By the late 1930s, Resurrection Mary was no longer just a tale whispered in dimly lit bars. She was a fixture of Chicago folklore, her presence feared yet strangely revered. Children dared each other to walk past the cemetery at night, while drivers swore they would never stop for hitchhikers along Archer Avenue again. But Mary was not finished. Her appearances grew bolder. Some said they saw her wandering directly inside the cemetery, drifting among the tombstones, her dress rippling though the air was still. Others swore she stepped into traffic, forcing cars to screech to a halt, only to dissolve into mist before impact. Each story added to the terror, and yet a pattern emerged. She always returned. No matter the year, no matter the witness, Mary's pale figure would reappear, tied forever to that lonely stretch of road and the wrought iron gates of Resurrection Cemetery. It was as if the city itself had been cursed to remember her, and those who encountered her never forgot. Some were haunted by nightmares for weeks, the image of her cold gray eyes staring through them. Others avoided Archer Avenue altogether, claiming they could still feel the chill in their cars, as though an invisible passenger lingered long after the ghost had gone. By the end of that first decade, Chicago knew one truth. Resurrection Mary was not just a story. She was a presence, a shadow that could not be buried, a whisper that could not be silenced. And though countless tried to explain her away, hallucinations, tricks of fog, the power of suggestion, there was always another sighting, another trembling voice swearing, "I saw her. She was real." The legend of Resurrection Mary had only begun. Whispers in the wind. Chicago in the late 1930s was a city both bustling with modern ambition and haunted by the long shadows of its past. The smoke from the stockyards still clung to the evening sky, and the wind off Lake Michigan carried with it stories, some rooted in fact, others woven with fear. Among these stories, none grew faster or stranger than that of the ghostly hitchhiker who came to be called Resurrection Mary. At first, the encounters were whispers. A driver would mutter to his wife about the strange young woman he had picked up near Archer Avenue, only to see her vanish before he reached her destination. A taxi driver might share a hushed tale with his fellow cabbies during their late-night coffee breaks, insisting he had given a ride to a pale girl in a white dress who dissolved into nothingness when he pulled up near the cemetery gates. These accounts were fragmented, nervous, dismissed by some as the product of fatigue or drink. Yet, as the months passed, the whispers grew louder. By the early 1940s, the local newspapers had caught hold of the tale. The Chicago Tribune ran a short piece on the phenomenon of vanishing hitchhikers, and while the editors treated it with a mix of skepticism and intrigue, the readers were enthralled. Letters poured in from men and women across the city, each claiming to have seen or even spoken with the spectral girl. Some described her as radiant with golden hair and eyes full of sorrow. Others remembered her as gaunt, her skin unnaturally pale, her gaze piercing and cold. But all agreed on one detail: she was always dressed in a white gown, as though she had stepped directly out of a funeral procession. The legend deepened when the sightings clustered around Resurrection Cemetery. Gatekeepers swore they saw her glide silently past the iron bars at dusk. Local priests warned parishioners not to linger near the cemetery walls after midnight. Children dared one another to walk Archer Avenue alone, each terrified they might see the flicker of white in the corner of their eyes. What had begun as rumor now became an unshakable presence in the collective mind of the city. One of the most striking accounts came from a bus driver named James Moreland. Late one winter night, as snow whipped across the windshield and the bus rattled along Archer Avenue nearly empty, he spotted a figure standing at the roadside. She was motionless, dressed too thinly for the biting cold. Out of concern, Moreland stopped and opened the door. The young woman climbed aboard, her dress shimmering in the dim interior lights. She said little, her voice barely above a whisper, but asked to be dropped near the ballroom on 47th Street. Moreland agreed. Yet as he reached the stop and turned to announce their arrival, his bus was empty. Only a damp imprint on the seat remained. He drove the rest of his route in silence, never again speaking of the incident, except to his closest friends. By now, Resurrection Mary had become a name spoken in taverns and parlor rooms alike. Stories spread with eerie consistency, always the white dress, always the ride along Archer, always the vanishing before journey's end. Some witnesses were visibly shaken, swearing their lives would never be the same. Others sought the spotlight, retelling their encounters to curious journalists, embellishing the fear in their eyes for effect. Yet even skeptics found it difficult to explain the sheer number of reports. Was it a mass hallucination born from the city's weariness and desire for mystery, or was something truly restless stirring along Archer Avenue? The legend reached a fever pitch with the testimony of a man named Jerry Palis. Unlike others, Jerry's story was not about a fleeting vision on a dark road, but an entire evening spent in the company of the spectral hitchhiker. According to his account, Jerry met Mary not on Archer Avenue, but at the O. Henry Ballroom, one of Chicago's most popular dance halls at the time. She was beautiful, shy, and curiously distant, dressed in a pale gown that shimmered beneath the ballroom lights. Jerry recalled how they danced together for hours, how she spoke little but smiled often, her cool hands strangely cold against his own. When the night ended, Jerry offered her a ride home. She gave him directions that led inevitably back toward Archer Avenue. The drive was quiet. Mary sat close, gazing out the window, her breath not fogging the glass, though the night was bitterly cold. When Jerry finally pulled near Resurrection Cemetery, she turned to him, her eyes sorrowful. "This is where I must leave you," she said softly. Before Jerry could protest, she opened the door and stepped out. She walked toward the cemetery gates. In the glow of his headlights, Jerry swore he saw her dissolve into the night air, leaving only the wrought iron and snow behind. His account would become the most famous of all, retold countless times in newspapers, radio programs, and whispered conversations. Skeptics dismissed him, accusing him of invention. But Jerry remained steadfast, insisting until his dying day that the girl he danced with was no ordinary woman. And so by the mid-20th century, Resurrection Mary was no longer just a tale traded among cabbies and night watchmen. She was Chicago's most enduring ghost, a phantom woven into the very fabric of the city, a name that could chill the bravest heart at the mere mention. And as the decades passed, her story would only grow darker with new encounters that suggested Mary was not content to merely vanish into the night, but perhaps to reach out searching for something or someone among the living. The Ghost Hunters and the Graveyard Watch. By the time Jerry Palis's story spread through Chicago, the legend of resurrection. Mary had transformed from a whispered tale shared among drivers to a cultural phenomenon. Newspapers gave her nicknames: Chicago's vanishing hitchhiker, the girl in white, and the Phantom of Archer Avenue. Each name only heightened her mystique, and the city found itself obsessed. For some, she was a curiosity. For others, a terrifying reminder that the world was filled with mysteries beyond comprehension. Bars and diners along Archer Avenue became informal gathering spots for those who claimed to have seen her. Truckers swapped stories over coffee at 2 in the morning. Young couples on dates nervously recounted glimpses of a pale figure by the roadside. Some swore that a sudden, unnatural chill always preceded her appearance, as though winter itself had materialized in midsummer. The reports grew stranger. One cab driver described how Mary's reflection never appeared in his rearview mirror, even though she sat quietly in the back seat. Another claimed that after dropping her near Resurrection Cemetery, he found a set of small, wet footprints on his back seat, though no rain had fallen that night. A third insisted he heard her humming softly, a sorrowful tune that lingered in his ears long after she had vanished. Soon, the legend attracted thrill-seekers. College students formed groups daring each other to drive Archer Avenue late at night in hopes of spotting the spectral hitchhiker. Some carried cameras or tape recorders desperate to capture proof. Their laughter often faded into silence when a pale figure appeared ahead on the roadside, hand extended for a ride. Even skeptics admitted to a creeping dread when they traveled the route. The cemetery's night watchmen also began to report unnerving incidents. One recalled locking the iron gates shortly after midnight, only to see a young woman standing inside the cemetery, staring back at him through the bars. He rushed to investigate, certain that someone had broken in. Yet when he arrived, the figure was gone, the grass unmarked by footprints. Another watchman swore he heard sobbing among the graves, but when he shone his flashlight, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving him surrounded by silence and shadows. Word spread of handprints scorched or pressed into the iron bars of the Resurrection Cemetery gate. Locals whispered that Mary herself had left them in one of her desperate attempts to escape the realm of the dead. Though the cemetery later attempted to repair the marks, visitors claimed to see faint outlines, ghostly remnants of her touch. As weeks turned into months, the encounters continued. Some were fleeting, a glimpse in passing headlights, a white dress disappearing into the darkness. Others were profoundly disturbing. A bus driver claimed his vehicle filled with the scent of roses late one night as he passed Archer Avenue. Glancing into his large rearview mirror, he saw a young woman in white seated at the very back. But when he stopped at the next intersection, she was gone. The scent, however, lingered for the rest of his shift. The most chilling incident came from a delivery truck driver in the early hours of a fog-drenched morning. As he drove past Resurrection Cemetery, his headlights illuminated a figure walking slowly across the road. He slammed on the brakes, tires screeching. The figure turned her face, pale eyes, dark dress, shimmering, as though wet with dew. The truck skidded, stopping mere feet away. In an instant, the woman dissolved into the fog, leaving only a patch of frost on the asphalt where she had stood. The driver later confessed he quit his job the very next day, unable to return to the road where he had nearly struck a ghost. By the late 1930s, Mary's legend had consumed Chicago's imagination. She was no longer just a story. She had become an urban myth, living and breathing among the city's people. For every skeptic, there was another who swore on their life that they had seen her. She haunted not only Archer Avenue, but the minds of those who traveled it, a figure caught between worlds, and always she returned to Resurrection Cemetery. No matter where she was last seen, by a ballroom at a tavern or in the passenger seat of a taxi, her final destination was always the iron gates of the graveyard. Witnesses agreed on this. She would vanish before their eyes, dissolving into the shadows, as though drawn irresistibly back to her grave. In part 3 of the tale, the line between folklore and reality blurred further. Resurrection. Mary was no longer a singular ghostly sighting. She was a constant presence, a spectral companion to late-night travelers. And though many laughed nervously when telling her story, deep down, they all knew the truth. Anyone who drove Archer Avenue after midnight risked meeting the girl in white. But as her legend grew, so too did the fear. For some began to wonder, what if Mary was not merely an echo of the past, but something more sinister? What if she was not content to remain a passenger, but one day sought to take the wheel? The answers lay ahead, in the stories yet to be told, as the shadow of resurrection. Mary lengthened over Chicago's nights. The storm at Resurrection Cemetery. The legend of resurrection. Mary was no longer a whisper passed along in smoky taverns or late-night car rides. By the early 1940s, it had become a full-fledged phenomenon in Chicago's South Side. Newspapers were running features about the mysterious young woman. Some journalists treated it as little more than a curious ghost story, while others leaned into the horror branding her Chicago's vanishing hitchhiker. But beneath the headlines, something darker pulsed. Dozens of witnesses were claiming nearly identical encounters. Mary appeared most often in the cold. Winter nights when snow slicked Archer Avenue and the wind howled off the prairie seemed to call her forth. Drivers described a solitary figure walking along the roadside in a pale dress, her hair catching the glow of headlights. Always silent, always moving toward the gates of Resurrection Cemetery. One witness, a cemetery groundskeeper, later admitted that he had seen her many times. She would be standing by the fence, he confessed, not inside, not outside, just there. Like the frost itself had taken a shape. His story spread quickly, fueling rumors that Mary's spirit was bound to the frozen ground, forever repeating her walk toward the grave she could never escape. But the most infamous incident of this era occurred during a violent storm in January 1943. A group of young reporters, skeptical but hungry for a story, decided to stage a vigil at Resurrection Cemetery. They arrived with notebooks, cameras, and flashbulbs, certain they would expose the hoax. The night was brutal. Snow hammered the pavement in sheets, and the iron gates of the cemetery groaned under the weight of ice. The reporters huddled in their car engine, idling, windows fogging. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. They began to mock the legend until one of them noticed movement near the gate. A figure, pale and fragile against the storm, stood beneath the cemetery's arch. The reporters scrambled, fumbling with cameras, but as they opened the car doors, a wave of unnatural cold rushed in. The temperature dropped so sharply that their breath crystallized instantly. "She's there," one whispered. "She's right there." What happened next has been retold countless times, always with the same chilling detail. The iron bars of the cemetery gate began to rattle, not from the storm, but from some unseen force. The figure drifted closer, her face indistinct, her hand reaching toward the bars. And then, with a crack like shattering ice, the reporters swore they saw her pass through the gate itself. They fled in terror, abandoning their vigil. When they returned the next morning with reinforcements, they found something that has become part of Chicago folklore: strange impressions on the iron bars of the cemetery gate. Twisted metal warped as if pressed by unseen hands. Locals pointed to these marks for decades, calling them Mary's fingerprints. The cemetery eventually repaired the gate, but the story has never died. For skeptics, the warped bars were the result of vandalism or a careless accident with maintenance equipment. For believers, they were physical proof that Mary was real, that something supernatural had left its mark on cold iron. Even today, visitors to Resurrection Cemetery ask guides about the hands on the gate, and some still claim to see the faint outline of fingers burned into the metal. Part 4 closes with this lasting image: a storm-tossed night, a group of hardened reporters reduced to trembling witnesses, and the frozen hand of a ghost pressing against iron, desperate to escape or to warn those still living. Whatever Mary wanted that night remains a mystery, but her legend had stepped firmly into the realm of Chicago history, impossible to dismiss, impossible to forget. Chicago was no stranger to ghost stories, but what unfolded after the chilling events at Resurrection Cemetery in the late 1930s pushed the city into an obsession unlike anything it had seen before. The marks on the iron gate, those twisted bars that many swore had been bent by the ghostly hands of a woman in white, were now infamous. They became a pilgrimage site for thrill-seekers, skeptics, and believers alike. But the stories that followed carried something more unsettling than cold iron. They carried the breath of Mary herself. Taxi drivers were among the first new wave of witnesses. Men hardened by long nights on Chicago's streets spoke in trembling voices about a pale girl they picked up along Archer Avenue. She would slip into the back seat without a word, at first her white dress luminous even under the yellow haze of the street lamps. She always asked to be taken toward Resurrection Cemetery, and just as the headlights swept over the iron gates, the cab would jolt empty. The passenger was gone. One driver swore he heard her hum a fragile tune like an old waltz played on a broken gramophone. Another said her voice was clearer, a soft singing so melancholy it chilled him to the bone. By the time he realized the seat behind him was empty, his eyes were wet with tears, though he could not explain why. Couples driving home from late dances told similar stories. Mary appeared at the edge of the road, arm raised, thumb out, eyes dark pools reflecting the night. Some men admitted she was strikingly beautiful, almost heartbreakingly so. They let her in, perhaps hoping the ride would turn into more than conversation. Yet every story ended the same way: her sudden vanishing act at the cemetery gates. Word of Mary reached beyond Chicago. Newspapers picked it up. Some mocked it as the city's favorite ghost girl, while others leaned into sensationalism with headlines screaming about the vanishing hitchhiker of Archer Avenue. The city was divided. To some, Mary was a restless spirit. To others, she was a myth, a collective dream born of alcohol fog and loneliness. But a small group wanted more than rumors. Led by a man named Dr. Leonard Kessler, a professor with an obsession for spiritualism, they resolved to gather hard evidence. He was no stranger to the paranormal. He had written obscure treatises on seances and apparitions. But Resurrection Mary fascinated him like nothing before. Armed with a bulky camera, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and lanterns, he and 3 assistants made their way to Archer Avenue one frigid December night. The storm that greeted them seemed almost summoned. Snow whipped across the roads in fierce gusts, and the trees along the cemetery rattled like brittle bones. At midnight, they stationed themselves near the iron gates, their breath visible, their equipment ready. The gate, still bearing those warped marks, stood silent and menacing. Hours passed. The tape spun, the lanterns flickered. The assistants grew restless. Then, as the clock in the distance told 3, one of them gasped. She was there. Mary stood across the road, her figure barely more than a shimmer in the storm. Her dress seemed untouched by snow. Her face was pale, serene, almost carved in porcelain. She did not move, did not blink. Only her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed alive, fixed on the iron bars of the gate. Kessler raised his camera with shaking hands. The shutter clicked once, but when he lowered the lens, she was closer. No footprints trailed behind her in the snow. The men froze, their breath shallow. Mary's form glided to the gate, rested one hand on the twisted iron, and then faded like mist. They rushed forward, desperate to capture proof. Nothing remained but a series of faint impressions in the snow, too light for any human step leading into the cemetery itself. The prints vanished a few yards in, swallowed by the storm. When the group developed the photographs days later, their hearts sank. Each frame showed only the gate, the snow, the storm. No woman. The tape recorder, too, yielded nothing but static, except for one moment 3 hours into the night. A hum. Barely audible. A melody like a waltz, fragile and incomplete. Dr. Kessler never recovered from that night. He published his account in a small journal, insisting that Mary was real, that he had seen her eyes. But skeptics mocked him, and his career faltered. The assistants told their stories with trembling conviction, yet the evidence was thin. Still, for the city of Chicago, and for those who dared drive Archer Avenue on snowy nights, Mary was more real than any photograph could ever prove. And so the legend grew. What had begun as whispers was now a storm of its own, sweeping through taverns, radio shows, and late-night conversations. The ghost of Resurrection Mary was no longer just a tale. She was a presence, one that lingered at the edge of every headlight beam, waiting for the next driver to offer her a ride home. Part 6. The Patient's Voices and Aftermath. Walter Jackson Freeman's downfall did not silence the voices of those most affected by his crusade, the patients and their families. If Part 5 chronicled the collapse of the showman's empire, then Part 6 belongs to the people left behind in the wake of his ice pick, the men, women, and children whose lives were forever altered by the stroke of his instrument. Their voices, long suppressed or ignored, began to emerge as society shifted and medicine re-examined its past. What followed was not only an outpouring of grief and anger, but also a cultural reckoning with the meaning of healing, the ethics of power, and the human cost of ambition. The silenced voices speak. For decades, the voices of lobotomy patients were nearly absent from the public record. Many of them could not articulate their experiences after surgery. Others were institutionalized for the rest of their lives, their capacity to testify erased, along with their frontal lobes. Families bound by shame and stigma often kept silent. But as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, a different climate began to emerge. The civil rights movement, the rise of patient advocacy, and new ideas about human dignity pushed stories of lobotomy survivors into the public eye. Journalists began interviewing families. Authors began documenting cases. Scholars turned their attention to psychiatry's darkest chapters. Slowly, the silence broke. Stories of survival. Not all lobotomy patients died during surgery or spent their lives in institutions. Some lived for decades afterward, navigating the altered landscape of their minds. Their testimonies, when they could speak, painted pictures of confusion, emptiness, and struggle. One patient described the sensation as living with a fog that never clears. Another compared it to being a spectator in your own life. For some, emotions dulled. For others, impulses raged unchecked, leading to erratic behavior. What Freeman once touted as tranquility often translated into disconnection from family, from work, from life itself. There were moments of resilience, too. A few patients managed to build routines, marry, or work simple jobs. But even these lives were marked by an invisible absence and emptiness where possibility had once been. families in mourning. If the patients suffered, so too did their families. Parents who consented to lobotomies for their children were often haunted by regret. Spouses who believed the operation would save their loved ones found themselves caring for strangers who bore only faint resemblance to the people they once knew. One mother confessed decades later, "I sent my daughter in to be cured. She came back someone else, and that someone never came home." Another husband spoke of his wife once vibrant and full of laughter. After the operation, she laughed no more. She sat by the window, rocking as though waiting for a train that never came. These voices gave shape to grief that medicine had long dismissed as collateral damage. The family's mourning became testimony not only against Freeman, but against a system that enabled him. The rise of investigative journalism. In the 1970s and 1980s, investigative journalists began piecing together the hidden history of lobotomy. They tracked down survivors, interviewed families, and unearthed hospital records. What emerged was a chilling portrait of unchecked medical power and the fragility of human rights. Articles appeared in major newspapers detailing cases of children as young as 4 being lobotomized. Documentaries aired footage of Freeman at work, his bow tie, his hammer, his casual demeanor as he performed irreversible operations. The public, once enthralled by his showmanship, now recoiled in horror. The case of Rosemary Kennedy. Perhaps the most famous lobotomy patient was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. Kennedy. Though her operation had been performed by Freeman's colleague James Watts, Rosemary's tragic story symbolized the human cost of the procedure. Once a spirited young woman, Rosemary was left incapacitated, requiring lifelong institutional care. The Kennedy family, shrouded in secrecy, eventually revealed the truth. Her story became a rallying point for critics of lobotomy, proof that even privilege and power offered no protection from medical overreach. The cultural reckoning. By the late 20th century, lobotomy was no longer merely a medical footnote. It was a cultural wound. Plays, films, and novels referenced it as a metaphor for control, erasure, and dehumanization. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, both in novel and film form, seared the image of lobotomy into the public imagination as the ultimate act of institutional cruelty. Activists used lobotomy as a rallying cry for patient rights. Lawmakers debated the limits of psychiatric authority. Ethical boards tightened regulations on experimental procedures. The practice, once hailed as a breakthrough, became a cautionary tale. Long shadows. Even decades after Freeman's death, the shadows of his work linger. Some survivors remain alive, their lives shaped by his interventions. Their families continue to grapple with questions that cannot be answered. Who might their loved ones have become if not for the surgery? What potential was lost? What futures were erased? In hospitals and medical schools, lobotomy is now taught as history. A chapter of mistakes, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked innovation. But for those who lived it, it is not history. It is life. It is memory. It is the scar that never heals. Closing notes of Part 6. Part 6 turns the spotlight away from Walter Jackson Freeman and onto those whose lives he altered. Their voices, once silenced, now form the heart of the story. This chapter is not about surgical instruments or medical theories. It is about people, about families, about loss. And yet, it is also about survival. For in their testimonies, in their grief, and in their resilience, these patients and their families reclaimed a measure of dignity. Against the shadow of the ice pick they spoke, and in speaking they ensured that their suffering would not be forgotten. In the next part we will explore how Freeman's story and the voices of his patients reshaped psychiatry itself, forcing the field to confront its ethical failures and redefine what it means to heal. The record that wouldn't be silent. By the time the spectral hymn bled from tape to radio to living rooms across Chicago, Mary was no longer just a South Side rumor. She had become an atmosphere, something that seeped under doorframes, and into conversations, something people met in the static between songs at midnight. Men turned down their car radios when Archer Avenue crept up before their headlights. Women tugged coats tighter when the lake wind carried a note they almost recognized. Skeptics formed their own chorus. Engineers on news panels called the hymn an illusion of harmonics, a trick of wind and wire. Psychologists on Sunday columns chalked it up to mass suggestion. Yet each neat explanation drew out fresh voices. Truckers rolling down I-294 confessed to seeing a woman in white on the shoulder hair motionless in a wind that bent the trees. A cabbie said the dome light never came on when she opened the door because the door never opened. She was simply there, as if the back seat had remembered her before he did. One man tried to photograph her with a flashbulb. The bulb popped, flared, and died. The camera coughed out a frame of pure milk white. He threw the picture away. Later, his wife said the wastebasket smelled like old perfume. Michael Harrington, young, stubborn, and certain, decided to spend a night alone inside Resurrection Cemetery. He parked just beyond the gates at dusk and walked in with a notebook, a flashlight, and a recorder borrowed from a friend at the station. His breath smoked in the cold. He found a bench between two angel statues whose wings had darkened with soot, and he sat. He wrote times in the margin. 12 Joe 1, the wind lifts. 12 4 footsteps. 1:16 nothing. Nothing, nothing. At 2:13 a.m., the air sank. The cold did not creep. It dropped like a stone into water. Frost smudged the inside of the windshield. 3 knocks touched the driver's side glass, separate, spaced, decisive. Michael turned. No one stood there. He listened to the playback and heard only silence until the silence developed a texture like fine sand. Under it, a long, soft drag, as if fingers were being pulled down the pane. The city wanted a priest, and the priest they got was a retired one, Father Benedict, who had the soft voice of a man who had spoken too many last rites. He told a reporter that decades ago he had said Mass for a young woman named Mary. A family begged for privacy. A ledger burned in a rectory fire. She was real, he said. What followed her still is. When asked why no one could find her name, he looked beyond the camera and murmured, "Some families bury more than their dead." The interview would have sunk without a ripple were it not for Eleanor Walsh. She was small in a blue sweater she had mended many times, and she kept her handbag clutched like a relic. She said she had been Mary's closest friend. The dance hall, the fight, the door slamming, the running into cold air. Eleanor told it all without drama, and that made it worse. She didn't die there, Eleanor whispered. She left. And then she was gone. No body, only the silence that families make when they have decided what the truth will be. Reporters argued. Was the ghost on Archer Avenue the spirit of a girl the city never allowed to finish her life? Or was it the shape of a lie so old it had learned to walk? Cab companies changed their routes. Teenagers dared each other past the gates and came back pale, swearing that roses had bloomed in the ditch in December. It should have faded. Stories always do. But Part 7 ended with the sense that the city's explanations had run out of road. If Mary was not just a memory repeating itself, if she was not just a passenger practicing vanishing tricks, then she was a question, one that would not stop knocking, one that would not take no for an answer. The winter wind cut across Archer Avenue like a blade, rattling the bare branches that arched over the quiet stretch of road. By now, Mary was no longer just a ghost story whispered in taverns or retold in late-night radio shows. She had become something heavier, an unresolved piece of Chicago's past that refused to fade away no matter how many decades had passed. And in Part 8, the story shifted from folklore to a full-scale investigation, one that blurred the lines between history journalism and the paranormal. Reporters flocked back to Resurrection Cemetery with notebooks in hand, chasing every thread of testimony they could find. Files were unearthed from dusty archives, but many were missing pages singed along the edges, as if time itself or someone had tried to erase them. The older records contained fragments, death notices, funeral ledgers, and an obituary for a young woman whose face matched almost perfectly the sketches drawn by those who swore they had seen Mary. But her name was absent, replaced by smudges of ink that made it unreadable. Meanwhile, the townsfolk spoke of strange disturbances in their homes. Some claimed to hear knocks at the door in the dead of night, only to find no one standing there. What lingered instead was the faint trace of old perfume, something flowery and vintage, the kind of scent a young woman might wear to a dance in the 1930s. One woman insisted she had awoken to find her hallway mirror fogged as though someone had been breathing upon it. Written into the condensation were 3 words, "Let me in." This was no longer a mere campfire tale. Paranormal investigators arrived equipped with infrared cameras, EVP recorders, and electromagnetic field meters. They prowled the roads and cemetery grounds, calling out into the night. At first they captured nothing but static wind and the hum of passing cars. But then one recording stood apart. A whisper emerged, faint but undeniable, "I never left the dance." The phrase spread quickly, cited in podcasts, local papers, and even whispered by school children daring each other to walk Archer Avenue at midnight. Skeptics argued it was nothing more than interference, a trick of the ear. But those who had studied the recordings knew the voice carried a strange weight, the kind of sorrow that does not belong to static. And then came the encounter that shook even the hardened skeptics. A young man named Daniel, a college student driving home late one stormy evening, claimed he picked up a young woman hitchhiking near the Willowbrook Ballroom ruins. She wore a pale dress that seemed out of time, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost melodic. She asked him about the music on his radio jazz from a station that played old records. They spoke briefly, and Daniel swore she smiled at him before he reached the stoplight. Then, in an instant, she was gone. The passenger seat beside him was empty. Yet the leather was damp and cold, as though someone real had sat there moments before. Shaken, Daniel pulled over and refused to drive for nearly half an hour, replaying the conversation in his mind. When investigators later interviewed him, his story never changed. The detail that disturbed them most was not her sudden vanishing, but her final words before she disappeared. "The dance isn't over." By the end of this chapter, one thing had become clear: Mary was not bound to a single road, a single cemetery, or a single legend. Her presence was evolving, adapting, reaching further into the lives of those who thought they were safe from the past. And with each encounter, the question grew louder. What unfinished story was she trying to tell? And why, after all these years, did she still wander looking for a ride home that she could never complete? The surge of fear. The winter that followed Daniel's encounter broke early and mean with rain that froze itself to windshields and a fog that learned the streets by touch. The tape with the whisper, "I never left the dance," had made the rounds in bars and kitchens. Now it turned up in classrooms, on late-night call-in shows, in police briefing rooms where no one admitted to believing it. People stopped talking about whether Mary was real and started talking about what to do if she appeared. The change began with the calls. Dispatchers at Cook County logged them without comment. White female appears as a pedestrian, Archer and 63rd. Possible psychiatric, refuses assistance, vanishes. Possible prank complainant, hysterical. The language tried to hold the shape of the nights, but the nights kept changing shape. A constellation of little events blinked on and off, until one evening they aligned. It was a Wednesday. Wind brought the smell of the canal and rattled the old willow by the ballroom ruins. At 11:22 p.m., a school teacher named Ruth Klein phoned 911 from her sedan. "There's a girl in the road," she said steadily. "She's not moving aside." The call cut for 2 seconds and returned carrying Ruth's breathing. "She is looking at me," she said. "Her dress isn't wet. Everything is wet, and her dress isn't." Patrol car 42B found no pedestrian, only tire marks that braided into a stall, and then began again. In the dash cam audio, somewhere under the static, a melody tries to stand up and keeps falling. At 11:41 p.m., a rideshare driver, the kind that keeps his own logs and his own secrets, reported a passenger who never touched the door handle. She sat behind him and asked very politely, "May I have a ride along Archer?" His cabin temperature dropped 4 degrees in 1 minute, which his phone dutifully recorded for the trip summary. He kept driving until the gates came up out of the dark like a stern rebuke. The light went green and he went through it. When he checked the mirror, the back seat was already remembering being empty. He pulled to the shoulder, shook, and took a photograph. The picture shows an ordinary interior except for the seatbelt buckled by no one. At 12:07 a.m., the calls stacked. 3 vehicles on the same stretch of Archer reported a woman stepping off the curb in unison, as if to cross, as if to lead. Each driver braked. 2 stalled. One man swore she placed her palm on his hood. He told the officer that met him the metal was cold for an hour afterward, colder than the air, colder than his hands could stand. When the officer shrugged, the man put the officer's fingers on the hood. The officer jerked back, swore, and said nothing in his report. By 12:30 a.m., the intersection at Archer and Keene became a congregation. People did not say they were there to see her. They said they were driving by, that they were only curious, that they were headed home anyway. Phones lifted like a field of flowers. A boy climbed the fence to the cemetery and dropped down on the other side. He took 1 step and then stood still. Those at the gate would later claim there was a line of frost laid across the grass, inside curve for curve, matching the drive like a road, laid down for those without bodies. Chicago police convened at the district house the next afternoon. The meeting was brisk, embarrassed. The captain disliked the word ghost, but disliked panic more. They discussed traffic patterns, extra patrols, the possibility of pranksters, and the probability of alcohol. They also discussed the numbers. Over 6 months, Archer Avenue's south stretch had gathered 124 citizen reports involving a single female pedestrian who then could not be located. 19 stalled vehicles with no mechanical explanation, and 6 dash cams that failed, then rebooted to a timestamp of 12:03 a.m., no matter when the failure occurred. A detective circled the 12:03 on the whiteboard, without comment. In the hall after 2 rookies compared gooseflesh and said nothing else. While the city rehearsed its reasonable faces, the unreasonable kept behaving like weather. A power dip rolled down Archer in a wave so visible that porch lights bowed and rose like heads in prayer. The wind pushed voices through chain-link fences. A pair of teenagers recorded a stretch of silence so quiet it sounded loud, and somewhere inside it, 4 clear piano notes, as if a hand had tested keys behind a closed door. That was the week the radio learned a new trick. Commuters reported brief intrusions, not quite stations, a woman's voice threading between traffic updates and advertisements asking ordinary questions. Is it far? Would you turn down Archer, then losing the signal and becoming the signal? A thin, wavering line that made the dash lights flutter. A man at a stoplight turned the knob to off and kept hearing her longer than the speakers were allowed to speak. He opened the door to let the sound out. It stayed. The city's patience wore thin, and where patience wears thin, entrepreneurs proliferate. There were tours, now buses with slogans painted on their sides, and windows covered in cling film stars. There were vendors near the gates selling roses in December and postcards of the iron bars. There were guides who could never agree whether reverence or volume got better tips. The cemetery posted a sign asking for quiet. The quiet deepened the listening. Even the skeptics learned to lower their voices there. On the first Friday in March, a film student named Isla prepared an experiment. A line of vehicles, walkie-talkies, synchronized watches, 4 dash cams apiece, and a map of Archer with pins stuck in it like stitches. They would drive the stretch in procession from the ballroom ruins to the gates and back again twice, filming continuously, logging time, temperature, and anomalies. They called it a convoy. It felt like a pilgrimage. At 11:58 p.m., the first car rolled. Isla sat in the third with her camera on a mount and her hands folded to stop the tremor. She watched the world through glass and pixel. The first pass produced nothing but the strange comfort of failure. It is a relief to be wrong where fear is concerned. On the second pass, just past the curve where the trees knit branches across the sky, the first radio hissed. "Check, check," said a driver. He heard himself answered by a voice he did not own. "Check," the voice said back in a woman's register, and laughter roamed the convoy, tinfoil and nerves. The fourth car reported fog that no one else could see, filling the interior from the floor up. Isla whispered the time, 12:03. They did not see her until every driver knew they would. She stood at the margin of the shoulder, a seam between road and grass as if stitched there. The gown was not bright. It drank light. What everyone remembered most was the patience in her posture. Drivers braked without talking about braking. The last car stalled as if cued by an unseen hand. Isla's camera showed a band of interference, a tangle of gray, that learned the shape of a person and then forgot. The convoy went to hazard lights and made a motionless river of amber. From the middle car, someone asked, "Do we offer?" No one answered aloud. But 3 doors opened in a row. Grown people stepped carefully onto the shoulder and felt that the shoulder did not feel like ground. A young man approached with the ritual slowness humans adopt near high ledges and haunted houses. He said, "Miss, and can we help?" and "Are you all right?" And then, because something in him knew how to speak to relics, he said, "Do you want us to take you home?" The radios squealed. Every channel filled with a wash like river water. Out of it rose the same hymn as the tape, but this time it had lyrics, and this time there were 2 voices carrying it, hers and a shadow of hers. The gates answered by rattling once and then holding very still. Isla, who had not moved closer, said later that stillness is a kind of answer too, and sometimes a worse one. No one saw Mary enter a car. No one saw her move at all, but 3 back seats depressed by an inch for the length of a city block. One seatbelt clicked without a hand. One mirror collected a breath that did not fog the glass, only asked it to remember. Then the hymn thinned until it was only the aftertaste of music. The radios cleared. The hazard lights winked themselves steady again. A driver threw the convoy into first. Like that, the procession returned to being cars. The students spent a week haunting a dim lab, feeding footage into software and hope into conclusions. What they extracted could not earn a grant or even a local award. A bar of video corrupted at 12:03, a mechanical thermometer that dropped 7 degrees and recovered in 2 seconds. 3 frames in which the road shoulder looked artificially brighter, and if you layered them, if you wanted it to be true, you could persuade yourself the shape in the brightness was a girl with her head slightly bowed. But data was not the point anymore. Fear spreads faster than proof, and faith requires no footage. On Archer, drivers who had never heard the story began to slow at the spot where everyone else slowed. Cameras bought with Black Friday coupons learned to wait for miracles. Elsewhere, the past began returning items it had borrowed. A box emerged from the basement of a closed florist. Inside lay dance cards from the 1930s, a napkin with a name blurred by water, a photograph of a young woman half turned away, and behind her the O. Henry ballroom sign, whole and neon. The face might have been Mary's, or the city's idea of Mary. On the back, a hand had written in tidy script, "Ask me for the last dance. No year, no day. Only the dare." When the Tribune called the police for comment on the convoy, the PIO said what he could say, "No evidence of a public safety threat. Please don't block traffic. There will be increased patrols." Unofficially, an officer who had felt the cold hood sent a text to Isla. "When you go back, take roses." He did not say why. She bought 12. The following Saturday, near the same curve, a dozen cars slowed of their own accord, as if some shared muscle remembered the motion. A light rain taught the road its own reflection. In 3 different vehicles, radios failed to find a station and found a girl instead. She did not ask for a ride. She asked a question competent people cannot answer: is it far? No one said yes or no. The convoy left the roses against the gate and turned for home. In the morning, the stems were scattered and the petals had arranged themselves into an arc on the pavement, a crescent with room for one more step. By the end of the week, the surge had a calendar name and a neighborhood flavor. People charted sightings like weather maps. A podcaster produced solemn episodes with timelines and witness composites. A skeptic with a kind face mapped Archer Avenue's accidents for 30 years and announced a normal distribution. Someone else mapped the timestamps and found a preposterous one. 12:03 belonged to her now the way addresses belong to houses. Part 9 closes without a skeptic's victory or a believer's proof. It closes with a city rehearsing how to live with a question that rides shotgun. The convoy's footage is inconclusive. The song on the tape is clearer than comfort should allow. And somewhere between the ballroom ruins and the gate that pretends it can keep its dead, a young woman stands where the shoulder meets the road. If you pass her, you will know what to do, even if you have never heard this story. You will slow. You will look. You will feel the cabin grow colder and the radio grow confused. And when a voice asks if it is far, you will say something kinder than the truth. Because the truth whispered in precincts and kitchens and to old friends on porches is that the dance is not over. It has simply moved into the hour that belongs to her, and it is teaching the city how to count the steps. In the final chapter of Resurrection, Mary's haunting unfolded with an intensity that seemed to bend reality itself. By the time the reports from Part 9 had circulated of phantom figures seen along Archer Avenue, of cars swerving to avoid a pale woman who vanished upon impact, the public's fascination and dread reached a fever pitch. News crews camped along the stretch of road. Skeptics and thrill-seekers crowded the taverns and roadside diners, and local police reluctantly increased patrols. Yet no one could prepare for what came next. It was a cold night in late autumn. The wind carried brittle leaves across the pavement, rattling like bones on the asphalt. A full moon glared above, silvering the cemetery gates where Mary was said to have returned after each encounter. At 11:45 p.m., drivers began to report her presence again. First, a taxi driver claimed a young woman in white hailed him near the Willowbrook Ballroom, only to vanish from the back seat as he passed the cemetery. Minutes later, a pair of teenagers swore they saw her walking against the traffic, her white dress fluttering, though the air was still. Each call echoed the same theme: she was there, but she was not whole, her eyes too hollow, her steps too soundless. By midnight, chaos ignited. A string of 911 calls jammed the lines. One caller screamed that she had walked straight into his car, leaving no dent but a lingering frost across the windshield. Another insisted Mary appeared in the middle of a crowded diner, standing silently by the jukebox, before flickering out as if swallowed by shadow. The accounts overlapped and collided, but all carried the same strange timestamp. The number returned like a curse. Some whispered it marked the hour of Mary's death. Others claimed it was the exact minute of an unfinished waltz, frozen forever. When the town clock struck 12:03 that night, traffic cameras near Archer Avenue captured a blur of white crossing the road, only to dissolve when rewound frame by frame. Investigators grew desperate. Historians combed records searching for any Mary linked to the cemetery. A few names surfaced: young women who died in the 1930s, victims of accidents, illness, or heartbreak. But none fit the legend completely. It was as if Resurrection Mary was not one girl, but many. A composite spirit. A vessel of every lost soul still wandering between dances, between farewells. Then came the final night. On November 14th, an organized convoy of journalists, locals, and ghost hunters parked along Archer Avenue, their headlights cutting through the mist. Midnight approached. Cameras rolled. Digital recorders hissed with static. At exactly 12:03, the temperature plunged. Car batteries failed one by one, extinguishing beams of light, until the road lay under moon and shadow alone. Silence spread, unnatural, suffocating silence, and then she appeared. Mary stood in the center of the road, her gown radiant yet tattered, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and accusation. Witnesses described her lips moving as if whispering a plea, though no words reached the living. Some claimed she raised her hand pointing toward the cemetery gates. Others swore she beckoned for them to follow. The bravest stepped forward, but in that instant the figure shattered into pale fragments that scattered like ash on the wind. When power returned minutes later, every recording device had failed. Cameras showed only black screens. Audio recorders captured nothing but a low hum that stretched exactly 63 seconds. Skeptics dismissed it as mass hysteria, a trick of nerves. But those who stood there, who saw her, carry the memory with them like an unhealed scar. Resurrection. Mary has not been seen in such power since. Sightings continue, faint, fleeting, but never again in such terrifying unity. The legend remains unfinished, as if waiting for its final verse. Some insist Mary is still searching for a ride home, Others believe she is not searching at all, but warning, reminding the living that the road between the Willowbrook Ballroom and Resurrection Cemetery is thin and the boundary between past and present thinner still. Even now, Archer Avenue draws late-night travelers. Some go out of curiosity, others out of bravado. Yet those who drive alone often speak of glancing at their rearview mirror and finding the back seat occupied. A pale face, a restless passenger, a girl in white who should not be there. So if you ever find yourself on that road, beneath the cold moonlight, at 12:03, ask yourself, will you offer her a ride? Or will you pray she passes you by? Because resurrection, Mary waits, and she has all the time in the world.